The stalwarts and the half-breeds battle it out at the Republican convention in the summer of 1880. After 36 ballots failed to produce a winner, convention delegates seem hopelessly deadlocked.
The Republicans in their convention said, let's look at our options here, and they turned to Garfield. One of the reasons that they turned to him was his prominence in Congress. And he was a very intelligent man. He was learned, enjoyed the classics. Really, I think would have been an interesting figure in the White House had he lived.
Sharing the Republican ticket with Garfield is Chester A. Arthur of New York Customs House fame.
Chester Arthur, it is said, went to Conkling and said, well, they've offered me the vice presidency. And Conkling, the head of the stalwart faction, said, well, of course you're going to say no. And he said, no, I'm going to say yes. This is the most important thing that's ever happened to me in my life. And thus a president was made.
In July of 1881, only 4 months after his inauguration, a deranged gunman cuts short Garfield's term in office.
The assassin of James A. Garfield, who shot the president in the train station July 2nd, 1881, yelled out, I'm a stalwart and now Chet Arthur's president, or words to that effect. Obviously, he was not there on orders from Chester Arthur or anything like that. In fact, the assassin was insane. But Arthur comes into the presidency under a cloud, but he conducted himself much better than anybody in the country ever expected that he would.
After the Civil War, many Americans returned to or began farming. But over the next decades, there was an overproduction of farm goods. With more supply than demand, prices plummeted lower and lower. At the same time, the cost of seed, fertilizer, and railroad transportation increased, leaving more and more farmers little money to support their families and still pay their debts to bankers. In protest, farmers began to organize political parties. Of them, the Populist Party emerged as the most powerful. The Populists supported an income tax based on earnings to support the government, rather than the tariffs then charged to farmers and businesses. They demanded a shorter workday, government loans to farmers, the direct election of state senators, secret ballot voting, and other election reforms. But Republican William McKinley defeated the populist-supported presidential candidate, Democrat William Jennings Bryan, in 1896. And the Populist Party, if not its causes, faded.
I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. Mr. Carlyle said in 1878 that this was a struggle between the idle holders of idle capital and the struggling masses who produce the wealth and pay the taxes of the country. They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country. We care not upon what line the battle is fought. If they say bimetallism is good, but that we cannot have it until other nations help us, we reply that instead of having a gold standard, because England has, we will restore bimetallism, and then let England have bimetallism because the United States has. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
William Jennings Bryan. By newspaper accounts from that day, the conventioneers were stunned by the speech. There was a moment of silence as they looked upon Bryan on the podium, arms outstretched, as if crucified. Then they began to chant, "My God, my God, my God," as they stampeded toward the man they would nominate the next day as the Democratic presidential candidate, effectively taking the wind out of the populist sails and ending that third party's best chances of breaking the two-party system. That was 100 years ago today. Our recording of William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech was made in 1923.
The Bryan-McKinley election was really about two different American myths. One was the myth of the self-made man, the man who rose from his rural origins on the farm and became a wealthy industrialist, succeeded in business. That was McKinley's myth. That's what he tried to sell the American people. This appealed to urbanites, businessmen, the middle class, and the upper class. The other myth to which Bryan appealed was the myth of the yeoman farmer, the idea that the farmer had always been the most virtuous, the ideal citizen of an American republic, not the businessman. And yet, urbanites were becoming more and more numerous. Cities were growing at an unprecedented rate in the late 19th century. The myth of the self-made man was becoming much more important to Americans than the myth of the yeoman farmer. The election was in many ways about respect. It wasn't just economic issues. It was about whether farmers really were the ideal citizens of the republic, whether they would be accorded the respect that traditionally they had been accorded, or whether urbanites and businessmen in particular would receive the sort of hero worship that farmers had known in earlier decades.